Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's wonderful to see some rows filled. And as Naseem said, I've been working on Kashmir for a number of years as a journalist and reporter. I've been fortunate to visit both sides of the line of control. And I think that you've heard very fully from Tariq Nakash his views, and I think it's very important because one of the problems of the Jammu Kashmir issue is that it is often taken over by what I would say, quotes, foreign speakers because Kashmiris can't speak. And the instance you have just referenced, Naseem, of fear of saying something has really dominated getting a true perspective of what's going on the ground. And I've certainly found this myself when I've been to the Valley of Kashmir, that I can speak to people off the record, but the minute I say, will you go on the record, they say, no, we'd sooner not because of reprisals. This is a very unequal situation. It doesn't give you the equilibrium of freedom of speech, of the values that we all like to try and uphold. What I do want to do, really to try and complement what Tariq has said, is just in a way to roll back the history. Obviously I'm going to talk about the abrogation in a minute, but I think it's very important, especially as I see there are young students here, young lawyers, to understand what we are actually talking about, because this is one of the problems which I think has held back a resolution of the Jammu Kashmir issue, is that we talk very freely about Kashmir, we talk very freely about self-determination, but we do have to go back to 1947 to understand what the Jammu Kashmir dispute is and what the situation is on the ground for all the components of the state. Even if we tick off the box and say, well, the situation is not as bad in that region, it's not as bad in the other region, we do have to know what we're talking about, because especially if you want to involve the international community, they also have to understand what is being talked about. We don't have a map here, but let us remind ourselves of the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, which includes Gilgit-Baltistan, Azad Jammu and Kashmir, Ladakh, the Valley of Kashmir, and Jammu. Now, I always equate it to a large butterfly sprawling across the Himalayan mountains. But until we have a resolution of the dispute, we don't have settlement of any of these regions in terms of their future political allegiance or status. We talk again, and Tariq has mentioned this, the UN framework. That's what the UN framework is looking at, the resolution of what is the future of the entire state. And there is no mention of chipping and chiseling it down into its zonal preferences. It is the entire state. And this is what has tripped up resolution for so many decades, because you get stuck on the fact that, well, the Ladakhis are happier with their status as it is. The Gilgit-Baltis are happier with their status as it is. And so by definition, if you're looking at resolution, are we looking at a zonal resolution? Are we looking at what for many is a heretical resolution by splitting the state? And this has to be on the board for discussion, because otherwise we'll get nowhere. If we talk in non-substantive terms about the valley or just Kashmir, we've got to put it in context with the whole region, because as we know, what we are really talking about is the disaffection, is the suffering, is the human rights abuses which are going on in the Valley of Kashmir. That is the real region of contention, that's the region of misery, and that's the region that has been most affected by the abrogation of Article 370. Now, I happened to be in the Valley of Kashmir just before the article was abrogated. There was this mood in the air that the Modi government is going to put its money where its mouth is, so to speak, and it finally is going to go for abrogation. A lot of Kashmiris were very concerned, they were very jittery. Not so much for what it would mean in practical terms, because they didn't anticipate some of the fallout, but in emotional terms. Ever since 1947, they've always had this ability to feel they can they can take strength from the fact that they are protected by Article 370. Therefore, the abrogation in terms of morale was very demoralizing. More demoralizing was abrogating the state's status as a state and turning it into a union territory so that it is governed from New Delhi. The second fallout, of course, has been, as Tariq has mentioned, the demographic changes which have been put into effect. Because all the time, the valley, and we aren't talking about a very large region. Yes, it may have I think you said 6.8 million people, but in terms of length and breadth, it's roughly 90 miles long, 20 to 25 miles wide. That is the Valley of Kashmir, surrounded by the mountains. The larger regions are far less populated. But if you think of the flood of people coming into that beautiful valley who are non-Kashmiri, that is what has hurt the Kashmiris by the abrogation of Article 370. Politically, many of the rights had already been abrogated and handed over to the Indian government. But the emotional aspect, the removal of the flag, this did upset Kashmiris tremendously. And practically, the fact that the land, which is small, and that's why that Hereditary State Subject Act in 1927 was passed, so that people didn't just flood up and buy property, rich Indians from the plains. And Nehru himself, when he endorsed it, Article 335A, I haven't got the exact quotation in front of me, but he said, why should we allow our beautiful Kashmir to be more or less inhabited by carpetbaggers? He didn't quite use the word carpetbaggers, but that was the implication. And so we are in a very transitional phase for the Valley of Kashmir, because we don't know how we can ever go back. And I think that's what has been particularly challenging, and certainly in the 5-year period since the article was abrogated, there is this feeling, and I know certainly Pakistan, and you will be talking about this, Naseem, Pakistan's policy was, well, we're not going to have any talks with the Indian government until they put back Article 370. This, I think, we have moved away from. There is not much anticipation, not much hope, especially with elections taking place in India later this year, and indeed the return of the Modi government, that they will go back on what they've said. But within this, we do have to have some hope that the situation on the ground for the inhabitants of the Valley of Kashmir can be improved. And I think one of the most important moves forward in this regard is returning state status to the Valley of Kashmir and indeed to Jammu. The current situation which we have bears no relation to ground realities. If you think about the map which is issued and distributed to all embassies and to all countries, that map shows Jammu and Kashmir as a union territory, including Azad Jammu and Kashmir. Imagine if you're a student of Jammu and Kashmir in an Indian high school and you're handed this map and you're going to think, well, that's nice, I might trot off to Muzaffarabad. No indication of where the line of control is. Likewise, the union territory of Ladakh includes Gilgit-Baltistan. And also, by the way, totally neglects the fact that China is occupying the northeastern wing of Ladakh, Aksai Chin. So we're starting in very obscurantist understanding if you're looking at a map which is the official map of the government of India. I myself traveled, as I said, even before 2019, and even then the line of control was not indicated. Because constitutionally, as you know, from the instrument of accession, the government of India believes that the whole of the state of Jammu and Kashmir is part of India. So where next? We do need to look scientifically as to what bits of land are controlled by what countries, and whether the aspirations of the people living in those regions are met. And the irony is that if you go back to 1950, and I do advise anyone who's interested in understanding the history, because it's available online, The report of the Australian jurist Sir Owen Dixon made it very clear that the way forward was indeed a zonal plebiscite, because you can't have one grouping dictating the futures of another grouping where there is a dissension of a viewpoint. And I think it's a useful framework, and I would add that to your UN framework if you're talking about going back to UN framework and having a plebiscite at all, because it's very clear, and that's why one has to know and understand the complexities of the state. And again, look at the history. Parachute back to 1846. It was the British who, for strategic reasons, put together a state which actually didn't have any cultural or indeed religious or indeed linguistic affinity for their own strategic ambitions. They wanted to be able to count on the loyalty of the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir against the rising power of the Sikhs. And I've said this to a number of people, and they've said, what, the state of Jammu and Kashmir doesn't go back hundreds and hundreds of years? And I said, no, it was created in 1846 as a state. And so I think we must put all this into the equation when we're thinking about what next. Because what really is our objective? Our objective must surely be the human rights and dignity and freedoms for the people living in the Valley of Kashmir. Because it's their rights, their freedoms, which, as we know only too clearly, that are being restricted. The fact of the difficulty of getting a visa, the lack of freedom of speech, as Tariq mentioned, and as I've experienced, journalists who can't talk to you, so it's very difficult to get a true picture of what's going on because people are afraid. The rule of law, we are at a legal conference. The rule of law should be paramount. I have friends, including, you will know, Fahad Shah, who's Kashmirwala. He just wanted to be a journalist. He wanted to report on all aspects of what was going on. He's now been in jail for months, for over a year. This Khurram Parvez, human rights activist. There are so many more who are in jail. Then we've got a panel on enforced disappearances also later in the program. The disappearances in the Valley of Kashmir disappeared and with no trace. No accountability. Again, we can go on to the statistics of those who've already been killed, of the orphans, of the half-widows, women who can't remarry because their husbands have disappeared but haven't reappeared, and therefore they are half-widows. They don't know what's happened to them. These are the aspects that we want to look at and to try and resolve. And again, I repeat, through discussion, through negotiation, through somehow prizing open the conscience of the government of India, and if the world can help to prize open that conscience, so be it. But as I say, they need to understand what the issues are. And I think, I will conclude on the note that we must keep it in our public awareness, because you never know when those tectonic plates of diplomacy and public relations which exist between two countries can shift and be aligned. We've had moments, but they've been lost. But for the sake of humanity, we need to be present and correct when those tectonic plates realign. And if the international community can be helpful, so be it. We cannot meddle, but if we can be helpful as facilitators, I think that's important. You mentioned the instrument of accession being an international agreement, but as important is the Shimla, 1972 Shimla Agreement, which I think the narrative changed because the international community went to sleep on the issue, thinking, well, now they've agreed that Jammu Kashmir is a bilateral issue, then we don't have to worry about it. But read that, again, easily available online. It makes no mention of Jammu and Kashmir in that clause, clause 2. It says we agree to outstanding issues bilaterally or by any other means mutually agreed upon. So the way for international facilitation is open. And Jammu and Kashmir is mentioned in another clause at the bottom, that the ceasefire line will be renamed the line of control. But it's a narrative that has got into our rhetoric and hasn't been challenged. So I do think it's important to, and I would say this, wouldn't I, as a historian, to know one's history, because only by knowing the history can one be useful as an interlocutor. If you don't know your history, rings can be run around you by others who think they know more or maybe know more. So I encourage and exhort all students to understand what the Jammu Kashmir issue is. It's very complex, but it bears understanding. Thank you so much.